Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, mere mortality is our theme today. Later in the programme, we're going to be dissecting, with the writer Dai Smith, the mighty cadaver of working-class South Wales, the society of heavy industry, music, sport, politics and vivid argument that is, I fear, no longer quite with us. By remembering, can we freeze the seeds of a culture and regrow them later? Before that, we're going to be talking about scientific fantasies, including overcoming human limits, with the sci-fi author Paul McAuley, whose work tests the boundaries and politics of hard science, and the anthropologist Kathleen Richardson, who devotes her time to studying not humans but robots, or possibly humans studying robots. But first, though, the philosopher John Gray on the Immortalisation Commission, Science and the Strange Quest to Cheat Death, which is a study of Victorian and Edwardian psychics and Soviet would-be supermen and the more modern dream of uploading human minds into machines. John, you cover a vast range of different attitudes to immortalisation in this short book. Let's just start with the sort of late Victorian Edwardian psychics and automatic writing. This was, by your account, very much driven by the high mortality, not just of the First World War, but remarkable numbers of people dying quite early of typhus or whatever, relatively young, and a desperate desire to replace fading religion with something else.
That's right. In the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, religion had lost its emotional hold over large sections of educated people, the intellectual elite, but also large sections of the middle classes. And all of these, the whole society really was, in a sense, under the spell of science, and in particular of Darwinism. And what Darwinism had revealed was a world in which, when individual humans died, they vanished, and the human species would eventually be extinct. And that vision, at a time when, we tend to forget, infant mortality was still very high. People lost lovers and fiancés, husbands, wives, and so on, at a rate which we can hardly imagine. There was a tremendous amount of almost unbearable grief. And several of the people involved in these, to us, rather incredible experiments, people like the politician Arthur Balfour's brother, also a conservative politician, but who gave up politics to devote his life to the study of the paranormal, and many others, including many women who had lost children in early years or lost loved ones, were involved in psychical research, and in particular in this practice of automatic writing, in which it seemed to them that minds other than their own, including the minds of loved ones who'd passed on, were communicating with them by their hand moving and revealing messages, messages which offered consolation, offered meaning, and offered hope. So what I think it's important to realize is that for pretty well all of the people involved in this practice, it was a form of science. It was conceived to be science, not religion, because for them, science was the authority. So they turned to science, if you like, for an exit from the meaningless world that science had revealed.
It's a poignant story in many ways because it is driven by intense yearning and emotion a lot of the time, but it is unintentionally, from time to time, comic as well. And you tell the extraordinary story of the idea of creating a spirit child, a real child who was going to be a sort of future world leader. Yes,
one of the most extraordinary episodes in this period, the Edwardian period, concerns the belief among a number of leading psychical researchers that deceased scientists were engaged in a eugenic experiment on the other side, whereby a child would be designed on the other side and appear in our world with extraordinary capacities and abilities, so extraordinary that this person could transform the world and bring peace to it. Now, there is a kind of subtext to this, which is that the key automatist involved in this was a woman, a Welsh suffragette, actually, but also someone intensely interested in art, and also the British representative at the League of Nations who practiced under a pseudonym. She was someone who'd lost a child in infancy, someone with what was described as a strong predilection to paternity, married to an older man, who we now believe produced the child as a result of a covert relationship with Gerald Balfour, Balfour's brother. But the very idea that on the other side, as it were, scientific progress was advancing more quickly than in the earth, so that this child could be produced, and one was produced.
Henry Combe Tennant.
Henry Combe Tennant.
Yes.
A child did emerge, not it seems by virgin birth, and had an interesting life.
Welsh Guards, Second World War, it says here, captured in France, spent 2 years in German prison camps.
Later entered the Secret Intelligence Service, worked with Kim Philby. After the war, did a bit more of that, then quit to become a monk at Downside.
And became a monk for most of the rest of his life. So in a sense, he was interested in immortality and immortalisation in a rather different way.
Indeed, but he doesn't seem to have known of his own the role that had been assigned to him, or not fully, or not till late in life.
Now, you then jump on in the study to look at the catastrophically murderous and bloodthirsty Bolshevik belief that you get rid of enough bad humans and eventually you'll create better humans and sort of possibly even superhumans, and the strange story of Lenin's pickling, I think we could call it. But I'd like to jump on towards the end of the book where you raise the idea of the singularity, which is much talked about, Kurzweil, the notion that a human consciousness, not simply the information in the brain, but actually consciousness, will eventually be downloaded in some fashion onto a computer system, which would then allow that consciousness, yours or mine or anybody else's, to live forever.
Yes, the American writer Ray Kurzweil is widely influential, and he's a more radical proponent of immortality through science than earlier groups some of which still continue, who propose that humans achieve immortality by having their bodies or their brains frozen and then resurrected later and repaired. And for him,
freezing is not really good, is it? It doesn't work very well.
Freezing tends to damage the bodies, the cadavers, and so on in the brains. But in the Kurzweil, there's a more radical notion. It's that, as you say, human consciousness will be somehow stored on a computer and then uploaded. That individual human consciousnesses can be uploaded into a cyber realm where these consciousnesses can have whatever bodies they want. And for me, this is very like the Victorian and Edwardian spiritualist Summerland, because in that land, Summerland, you have a body, but it's not the body you had before. It doesn't have arthritis or warts. It's not ugly. It's somehow an enhanced version of your body. But of course, Kurzweil's is even more radical. He says you don't just have to have one virtual body. You can have as many as you like. The key thing, though, in all of this is the idea that new technologies in this case of the internet and of cyberspace, will enable humans to escape the natural limitations that go with being an animal of the kind that Darwin described.
And therefore that original intolerance of the Darwinian vision of eventual death and so on, the inability to accept that.
It's as strong today as it ever was.
As strong today. We've had plenty of biologists on this programme over the years who've ridiculed the idea, Paul McAuley, we're going to come on to your science fiction in a moment, of the singularity, being able to download a consciousness onto silicon, because they insist again, and no doubt rightly, that the brain is, after all, an embodied, fleshly, bony, part of a fleshly and bony structure and can't be removed from it. But it's an idea that in your world, in science fiction, just won't go away, will it?
No, and also that it's tremendously easy to interface with machines by simply plugging yourself in through the little node in the back of your neck has been prevalent for quite a while now as well. As science fiction writers always like, there's two ways of looking at this. First of all, the technology is friction free. You know, this seems Kurzweil assumes with this kind of weasel word download that which encompasses an enormous amount of difficulty and problems which the biologists would be getting at. It's much more like, I think probably they'd say it's more like a simulation than a download, because you'd have to simulate the state of every neuron, and you could only approximate that simulation. This is the big objection to it. So anything you do is only an approximation. It's not an accurate model. It's not a replica. Kurzweil seems to think that you can just replicate things in the same way that you can copy information on a CD onto a hard drive and then back again.
But a lot of science fiction seems to me to be driven by some of the same instincts driving the characters in John Gray's book, in the sense of the belief that eventually we'll be able to cheat death, or at least cheat our natural limitations and push beyond.
Yeah, I think a lot of science fiction is about death, actually, or cheating death, or confronting death, not only the death of yourself or the human species, but also, the heat death of the universe, which was discovered around about 50 years later after Darwin. There's another big thump there, that the universe isn't going to go on forever, that the Earth isn't going to go on forever, that there's a finite time, the sun will gutter out. If we go to other stars, fine, but they will gutter out too. And eventually the whole universe will gutter out, and there'll be nothing left for life to cling on to.
John used the word sinister earlier on, and I think what is quite sinister, H.G. Wells, who figures in your book, there's a narcissism there as well, isn't there? I mean, it seems to me that they are ignoring the specificity of other human beings, other than their own. So in Winifred Coombe Tennant's business of what did Nicole Kidman say? She was a gestation carrier, or for the Messiah. But in real life, she was embracing Wales and the nationalised Steddfod, and sometimes Lloyd George, as if that was the afterworld, or perhaps it was, here and then. And yet, when we go to Wells, you have this kind of progressivism which melds into, the appalling crimes committed in this instance within the lands of the Soviet Union, because other human beings are not human in their mind.
I think other humans are radically imperfect versions of a kind of ideal humanity, which is a projection of their own image they would like to have of themselves, that they see developing in the future. So they're not really interested in actual human beings. Not even.
You could have, just jumping in.
Yeah.
I mean, you could have equally gone to the Nazi experiments and talked about the perfect Aryan that was eventually going to be created if you waited long enough and got rid of all the.
The difference is that the Bolsheviks weren't racists.
Yeah.
But it is so. There's a profound difference in that respect, and the killing in the Soviet Union, although it was on a colossal scale, didn't involve the type of genocide that occurred in the Nazi lands. But where they were similar, and it comes out quite explicitly in Trotsky, is Trotsky explicitly envisaged using what he called psychophysical experimentation to create a higher human being. And Gorky, and I cite this in the book, wrote to Stalin saying, don't be too squeamish about the methods. We need to experiment on what he called human units.
It's just a disgusting phrase. We're going to come on to robots, which actually kind of fit into all of this in the politics as well as the time scale in a moment, Kathleen. But the quest to cheat death is also part of the history of the robotic.
Well, very interesting, because tomorrow is the 90th anniversary of the robot, which was a character in the play called Are You Are? Rossum's Universal Robots, and in it there's a strong sense of terminus and human destruction. So in the play, the robots eventually do all the human labour, apparently fitting in with this idea that if machines did our labour, then we'd have more freedom to go and explore our kind of interests. But as machines do, well, as the robots, they weren't actually machines at this point. As the robots do more and more labour, then they eventually become more powerful and they rebel and take over society. And that is the end of the human species, basically. So the themes of terminus are very much then and now still very much intimately connected with the idea of the robot. You could say there's almost a culture of death surrounding it.
So we're absolutely on the edge between the physical world in which we live and a fantasy world, and it's, as we've demonstrated, it's about the fear of death drives us over that edge, which takes us to Paul McAuley's writing, your science fiction writing, Paul. explain to us, you would describe yourself certainly most of the time as a hard science fiction writer. You're using hard science in your books, dealing with a lot of these themes. What is the definition of a hard science fiction writer as opposed to, I suppose, a soft science fiction writer?
Well, I suppose it's playing within the rules of what's known. You can start extrapolating wildly from what's known, but you start with a common ground that's shared amongst scientists. A good example would be using the speed of light, that you don't violate Einsteinian principles when you're travelling. If you want to get your character to star, they're going to have to spend at least, say, 4 years to travel 4 light years. They can't go faster than light because we know at present you can't go faster than light. It's impossible. You can. Other science fiction writers think, well, that's to get the story going. We'll just get around that. But so then you become slightly.
So you give yourself
that would be a slightly softer version. Yes. So you give yourself those limits, and actually, that you can play within those limits. That makes it quite interesting because you then get into all kinds of problems. How do you construct a ship that's going to last that long? I mean, 4 years is like the minimum time to get to the nearest star at the speed of light, assuming you can get up to the speed of light instantly and then get down to from the speed of light to rest again instantly. But it would, in fact, probably be much, much longer than that. And again, this comes into the idea of death. I mean, how in the normal human lifespan do you comprehend these vast interstellar distances? We can, we're quite...
You wake your people up after these long travels with appalling stomach cramps and bowel disorders and so on.
That's just the trip from Earth to Jupiter, which is a mere bagatelle compared to actual interstellar distances.
And we've also touched on robotics, but you've got a very interesting instance, for instance, where you've got fighter pilots in one of your books who have to be re-engineered to increase the speed of their reactions, which is coming close to some of the sort of engineering that we've been talking about in the Singularity.
Yeah, there's two ways. The first way of looking at re-engineering is to make yourself much more of an ideal human being, which is what I talked about earlier. But the other way of doing it is to make yourself more of an ideal kind of machine. And the fighter pilot idea was to try and fit them into the kind of machines they're going to operate in the same way that the Mercury and Apollo astronauts were selected and tested very relentlessly and brutally to basically become switch-throwing monkeys. They were the first astronauts in the American program were chimps who were trained to throw certain switches when lights came on to show that they could work in zero-G. And the scientists, some of whom came from Germany, Nazi Germany, had the same idea that the astronauts were basically what the astronauts called spam in a can. They were just there to throw switches. The astronauts, of course, rebelled against this because there's this romantic notion, which I obviously share, putting fighter pilots, in advanced spaceships. That you should have some human element there. It was important to have these kind of knights riding off into the wild blue yonder, representing humanity, and therefore. And so, in your case, the
brain is enhanced, and the neural systems are speeded up through.
Yeah, you're given this kind of secondary nervous system which takes over, this kind of secondary self, which is kind of sinister shadow self that does the operations. Yeah.
Your books, and indeed a lot of science fiction actually, also has a strong political element. We've touched on politics quite a lot already, but one of the things you seem to be doing is asking political questions, not quite like the Soviets, but you're asking about how the limits of human cooperation and adaptability.
Yeah, I started with a couple of novels thinking about what... looking at all the lovely pictures that came back from Cassini about the moon of the moons of Saturn, and wondering what it would be like to walk around there. As soon as you put a human being there, you immediately have this kind of trail. How did they get there? Why are they there? And how do they live? And in an environment like that, was incredibly hostile. There's no air. It's very, very cold. The obvious answer is, well, they'd have to cooperate, and you immediately start thinking of places like Antarctica, places where you're entirely dependent on technology to survive. If technology doesn't work, you're going to die. If you don't cooperate with with everybody around you, and they don't cooperate with you, again, you rely on the survivor, you're going to die. So the society was kind of built up from that kind of idea of cooperation.
While you've got figures in your books who may not live forever, but live for very, very long lifespans, 180, 200 years and so on, you're obviously worried about the inequality aspect of it, because you've also got sort of serfs and slaves. In other words, you suggest that if we ever advance, if that's the right word, which it's not, to a humanity which is enhanced and very, very long living, it will be at the price of other people, the majority, who can't be like that and are just used as objects towards that.
Yeah,
vide H.G. Wells.
Yeah, I suppose actually, unconsciously, we always go back to H.G. Wells because he came up with most of this stuff first, you know. But yes, certainly, the idea that if you're going to live longer, you're gaining some kind of capital, you're accumulating stuff. I mean, it's very unlikely you're going to have long-lived people who are very poor, living as beggars. You know, this would be rather difficult. So it's much more likely that the people who are going to live longest are those who have also got a lot of stuff to begin with.
Which takes us neatly to robots. And Kathleen, because the word robot is one of the relatively rare words in English which is Czech in origin, and it means...
to work slavishly.
Merely to work slavishly.
It's the extra labour. It's a feudal term. It's the extra labour that the serf used to give, actually. So it's that extra labour. And interestingly, you know, the idea of the robot was also a very political character. It was in the 1920s, the kind of context that inspired it was the Russian Revolution, the First World War, Fordism, this kind of obsession with kind of labour and production. So there was definitely a political entity, because sometimes we think of Terminator and we think of Hollywood depictions of it as this kind of creature, and it's stripped of all its...
And the Karl Čapek play, which is where it comes from,
yeah.
It's the robots are not actually machines at all. They're biological living humans, but without full consciousness. Is that right?
I think this is, you know, one of the most interesting things about the play, because obviously the Fordist production line was just taking off around the world. I mean, even in the Soviet Union, they kind of celebrated that Fordist approach to manufacture and production. So in the play, the human bodies are assembled on a production line. So, but it's biological material that's assembled. And what was quite interesting is that the first depictions of the play, if anyone looks at any pictures, they'll see robots that look identical to people. But by the end of the 20s, what happened was other artists, you've got to remember in the 20s, the kind of machine metaphor, that's science almost taking hold of the kind of imagery. The robot was transformed into a machine. So by the end of the 20s, early 30s...
They're clanking.
That's right. And then from there, you can really see that most of our concepts of robots are machines. But, you know, interestingly... you know, this kind of idea of the robot as a human entity, or where the boundaries lay... You know,
was there from the start.
Was there from the start.
And your research, although you're an anthropologist looking as much at robots as you are at people. And for those of us who are beginning to get slightly uneasy and possibly scared about this kind of chilly post-human future, you would say when it comes to robots, don't worry your pretty little heads.
No. When I first entered a robot lab back in 2003, I actually thought that from my childhood I had this kind of idea of robots being very sophisticated. And when I arrived there, I realised that actually they're not very sophisticated at all. In fact, some of the imagery that we see in popular culture and the media about robots are all kind of videotaped, perfect representations of robots working. And if anyone does actually interact with the robot, they'll know that it breaks down, and this is why this Ray Kurzweil idea. I mean, machines are continually breaking down, code is continually going wrong, and so I don't think we have to worry quite yet about the robot revolution, if ever. In fact, if anything, it's reinforced my notion that being human is very unique and distinctive, if anything.
Terrible to be downloaded and then somebody just simply changed the plug to do some hoovering and you've gone.
Well,
after all that effort.
You know, I kind of think this idea about science, sometimes we recycle very fundamental human ideas about existence, but we recycle them in new forms. Yeah. And, you know, this kind of idea that you can download your consciousness. Well, you know, when Marx wrote Capital, presumably he downloaded an aspect of his consciousness into a thing, didn't he? And when we create objects in our society, we're always downloading, or if you like, writing down, as my friend said, our consciousness or creating things.
So apart from the robots that are simple assembly machines working in factories on production lines, which we all understand, where do you think the sort of growth of robotics is going to go? Because you've talked about social robotics.
I think social robotics is the biggest departure from our kind of conventional notions of robotics. And I say that because, once again, when I kind of had an idea that the interest in humanoid robots was motivated by this desire to kind of assist people and help people. Now, obviously, John, you've highlighted problems with that in different cultures, but
there are some good examples of robots which can do those kind of things, from pets to carers.
Well, interestingly, when we kind of imagine the robot, it was as a worker, has something that did a task. Now the task that the social robot seems to do is engage in a social interaction with the person. Now, we then have to question whether we need machines to have social interactions with. And particularly a group in society that these robots are being tested on are the elderly, for example. And, you know, elderly people have that issue that they lose their siblings, they lose family members. As they grow old, in fact, their human relationships diminish. And for that group of people then to, like, have robots as their kind of social solution, I think is problematic.
I can imagine. There I've got my Kindle, and that's a machine which helps me to read. And I can imagine a version of a Kindle which talks back to me. And where I say that, you know what, that's enough trollop. Can we go to some Thomas Hardy or whatever it is? And they say, OK, all right then, because it's programmed to do so and reads it back. But that wouldn't be a robot. That would simply be another machine. I'm just wondering about the definition of robot now.
Well, it's a kind of vague definition, because a robot is a machine, but we imagine it to have some kind of mobility, some movement, something it can kind of do, some action that it can do. But there really is no difference between a humanoid robot and your washing machine. They're both machines. However, there's something very fascinating that happens, and as an anthropologist, we look at this. Once you start crafting human characteristics on things, people start to attribute all kinds of qualities to it.
I'd like to ask both you and Paul whether there is any evidence at all of, so far, of robotics or machines learning fast enough to actually be described as intelligent in any meaningful way.
I would say I'm not a scientist, so I'm sure there might be people who disagree, but in my interactions with scientists, I would say no.
Paul?
Yeah, I mean, there are some robots that can do very simple learning tasks. They can figure out how to get around a block on the floor, for instance, but not much more than that. I mean, I'm kind of interested in the fact that robots have to have bodies, because anybody who's used social media like Twitter have found all kinds of sort of spam bots and things like that, which pretend to be human, Twitter users, but actually are there to disseminate ads for diets and things like that. And perhaps that's one way that intelligence might accidentally come up is not, scientists in a lab designing robots, but ad people designing, ad robots that people eventually can't tell the difference between a robot that's talking to you on the internet and another person.
I was quite interested in the cultural things that Kathleen was talking about, as well as casting my mind back to robots that were kind. I mean, in my childhood, it was Robbie the Robot on Forbidden Planet, which, of course, comes from The Tempest and is Ariel. And then that takes you into John's distinctions, not distinctions, but the drawing together of magic and science. And in the early 1950s, there was a game called The Magic Robot, which I think came from the States, which is a little green figure that you put on one set, a magnet, on one set of a piece of paper, and it asked the question. They put him on the other side and he went to the question. And at the same time as that was being marketed, the Magic Robot in Britain, they were also marketing something that Eamon Andrews had brought out called the Great Marvello, who was a wizard with a wand doing exactly the same things. And I just have a feeling that particularly with robots, these issues of what can they do magically for you and what can they do scientifically is maybe still a confusion.
It also seems that every time there is a scientific advance, the sort of innate poetic, religious aspects of our personality want want to seize it and extend it endlessly to some sort of death-cheating transcendence.
I suppose the basic project of magic is to overleap natural boundaries, transgress them, so that we are more powerful, not mortal, and we can have all the good things without any of the bad things. And as Dai's pointed out, some of the ideas of robotics and many subsequent ideas have that characteristic. And I'd say that the confusion of science with magic is not a sort of ailment of our culture that we can hope to cure. It's sort of encrypted in modern life, because with the retreat of religion, which contains, if you like, elements of magic, the idea that we can somehow come back with our own bodies, but they're better bodies, and in a different world, but without all the sorrows of this world, and so on. These are kind of half magical ideas. These ideas have been channeled into science, and I agree with you, Andrew. I mean, it's exactly that way. Whenever there's an advance, and of course many of these advances are useful, it might be the case, as we've just been discussing, that some of these robots can be useful in some contexts for old people who've lost their human relationships and human networks. I'm not sort of adamantly saying that they might turn, but what they can't do is get round, as it were, the
limits of our
human
life.
situation, of our fleshly life. They can't. The idea that they can is magic.
Well, let's turn to a land of magic. Let's turn to a land of magic and a place which certainly demonstrates that the joys and the sorrows cannot be disconnected or unlinked. South Wales at the turn of the 20th century, beginning of the 20th century, the Welsh California gold rush territory, Dai. In your part of South Wales in particular, English-speaking by and large, but a real sense of boomtown and wildness from the coalfields.
Yeah, and I think one of the things about Welsh history is where it's still misunderstood, is that the images of the 30s, the hunger marches and the grainy newsreel, is still what sort of visits the sense of Wales. Whereas if you look at it in a different, if you like, in a longer time span, let's say from the 1890s to the 1920s, you have an extraordinary dynamic global capitalist society, one with boom and bust, huge amounts of immigrants coming in, as well as the Welsh transmigrating internally. We don't go to America like the Irish. We find American Wales within Wales. And that, in turn, led to the formation of what were meant to be consensual and stable communities under liberal politics and nonconformist religion. And, of course, it breaks apart.
Very quickly.
It breaks apart because of the pressures and, if you like, the massification. And then those other pulses of that history happen later on, down the road. I sometimes feel, looking at Paul, that Wales was living in a kind of a dystopia, a real dystopia, but aspiring to a utopia, or at least in forms of its socialist politics and unionism, looking for ways out of what were sometimes robotic conditions. And, if you look at the mass workforce in South Wales, 290,000 coal miners alone in 1920, and then you add to that, the people dependent upon that army. So you had aggregations of people brought together for the purposes of work who, and this in some senses is the burden of my book, form themselves into congregations and communities. And then the rest of the book really is about this long dying, I was going to say downloading, consciousness in the novelists and the painters and the photographers who try to give us, or I argue, they try to give us, articulate an expression of that society which is extraordinarily vibrant and ultimately, stick my neck out, valid.
Loquacious, highly literate, musical, and in some respects, at any rate, artistic. You start the book with a particular moment in time, a very, very specific, brief, frozen moment in time where you find your own grandfather in a crowd in Tonypandy. Just tell us a little bit about why that moment in time, apart from the personal connection, is so important in the story of South Wales.
Well, the importance is because what occurred in Tonypandy in 1910, the riots of Tonypandy, which happened over 2 days, there were further instances, was tied into a very long and difficult industrial dispute. Now, if you imagined in a counterfactual sense that the riots hadn't happened, that the commercial and social fabric of the township hadn't been destroyed, so it was just an industrial dispute, it would still be very important because it led, amongst other things, to the minimum wage strike of 1912. There were theories of workers' control, nationalisation, all the familiars, if you will. But what happened in Tonypandy broke the accepted bounds. You had people turning on, as it was said, their own kind, and the shopkeepers and the chemists who dealt with them. And traditionally this had been seen as a mob of drunken marauders or socialist inflamed ideologues or strangers coming for a bit of fun. And what I discovered, I hope, in my historical work was that it wasn't that. It was really enough is enough. It was a kind of a code.
A lot of these shopkeepers were renting out properties at exorbitant rates. It was an eruption against the whole system.
Yes, it deeply implicated the whole, if you like, class integration, and that's what upset. Churchill was the Home Secretary. Troops did come to Tonypandy. That's what upset Edwardian Wales. But also, if you like, moderate socialists like Keir Hardie, who incidentally also was a spiritualist in 1915, and the frozen moment, Andrew, was, we were celebrating Tonypandy, if you will, in Wales last year, and I'd looked at that photograph of striking miners going into a mass meeting, and I'd looked at it many times over the years because there was thousands of people in the photograph, and I suddenly did see in a clearer image my own grandfather.
He's got your nose and eyes. He's sitting in front of me now, though.
Well,
I can't tell about the hair because he's got a big cap on, like they all did.
It's quite a scary photograph in a sense because they are so massed, so uniform.
Yes.
What the hell are they going to do? Well, we do know they're about to wreck the high street.
Yes. This intense and very vivid culture starts to be destroyed, I suppose, as early as the 20s and 30s with the Depression there. And what it's left is still quite a powerful division in Wales about what Welshness is about and Welsh history is about. I mean, you're occasionally criticised, I think it's fair to say, by some of the more Welsh language Plaidist elements of your nation. That's a division which has always been there, but it's about as strong now as it ever has been.
Well, I think the criticism is there. I'm not sure it's as strong. I said those three pulses, and you mentioned the second, the Great Depression. I think the third really was welfarism and post-45 and a different kind of society. Now all of that has gone, and my book is a eulogy, but it's also an elegy. But I didn't want it to end on a dying fall, because I think we're actually into a fourth phase, if that's the right way of putting it, which is that the different cultures of Wales are in surprising ways coming together now because of the new institutions which have one way or another been created in Wales. So to give them vivacity at all, they have to be given the breath of life, which is more than political. If less than half the people vote in the elections in Wales, that's a cultural an error, if you want, and that has to be understood in terms of you build the culture or give up.
And your book, which you call Memory in Society, it contains exchanges of letters and profiles and essays on writers and artists and intellectuals, and tries to preserve some of the conversation and the wit. And I felt reading it that your hope was that if you can kind of freeze it all and put it behind under hard covers, then in some manner at some point parts of this culture that you love so much can be revived again after death.
I wouldn't take I wouldn't take freezing. I'd say that I'm trying to sing a song, and one can maybe hear some of the tune of that. It's a book about consciousness, and it's also a book which attempts to say that there was validity in some of the collective impulses of that society, which actually work for not just Wales, but for I'm tempted to quote the Prime Minister. We had a big society.
Well, I find all this fascinating. It's one of the things Dai's work teaches me and reinforces me in is the sense that human beings, all of us, are embedded in cultures. And when the cultures go, as it were, you can't bring those particular human beings back. And one of the oddities of this experiment in automatic writing at the start of the 20th century is that they communicate these supposed embodied, disembodied, deceased intelligences using cultural code, biblical and classical tags, Tennyson's and Browning's poetry with each other, in a way that was intelligible to all of the psychical researchers, but is completely unintelligible to us. Partly because we don't read Browning and Tennyson, the Bible and the classics in the same way. So the idea that these people, as it were, could go on immortally in a post-mortem realm is really inconsistent, not only with Darwinism, but with the facts of lived experience, which is that we're all embedded in cultures.
But
if the culture goes, we change or we go.
Yes, but you can goad and provoke people who haven't got a particular culture to a sense of envy or embarrassment, perhaps, and therefore to kickstart something.
I don't think there are any patterns or templates, certainly not in the culture I've been describing, and I don't think it's repeatable or in that sense translatable. But I do think, as I say, that there were values, and I'll call them moral and ethical as well, which do translate into the way people's lives are lived today and might give people some kind of sense. But it's more than that. I mean, I call the book Memory in Society, because having spent a life as a professional historian, it worries me that sometimes in professional history, historiography can actually freeze in the way that you described, Andrew. It can actually take people away from their sense of culture or the sense of belonging. And memory, not myth, but memory in society is I think, a kind of an emotional thing, which is worthwhile because it does allow different forms of growth, different processes.
Would you embed culture in that sense, Paul, in a science?
Yeah, I was just thinking of Dawkins and memes, and I was just wondering if you could think of culture as being a set of, this idea that memes are the culture equivalent of genes, and they're inherited and passed on if they're strong enough. And I just wonder if there's a sense that...
Trouble is, memes are myths.
Well, it's a little bit debatable. Let's just assume that they kind of exist, and just wonder if there's sort of elements of the culture that have been passed on still. I was thinking, for instance, of Bevan and the NHS and the post-war, the idealism of the post-war, the kind of that was a kind of utopianism.
I mean, there was a poll a couple of years ago, and Bevan was the most popular man of the 20th century in Wales, from all sides. Now, what people think they mean by Bevan is a different issue, but that memory is there.
That memory is there. Well, our ability to pass on memes and cultural DNA has run out because our time has. Thank you to all my guests. Kathleen Richardson is giving that talk entitled Will Robots Take Over the World on February the 24th at the UCL. Paul McAuley is taking part in Science Fiction and International Orders next month. Details on the Start the Week website. John Gray's The Immortalisation Commission and Dai Smith's In the Frame are both out now. Next week, Courage, Boldness and Rebellion will be celebrating the art of the manifesto with Neville Brody, Susan Hillier, Alex Danchev and E.C. Osundu. But for now, thank you and goodbye. Thank you for downloading the Start the Week podcast from BBC Radio 4. For more information, go to bbc.co.uk/Radio 4. Hello, mere mortality is our theme today. Later in the programme, we're going to be dissecting, with the writer Dai Smith, the mighty cadaver of working-class South Wales, the society of heavy industry, music, sport, politics and vivid argument that is, I fear, no longer quite with us. By remembering, can we freeze the seeds of a culture and regrow them later? Before that, we're going to be talking about scientific fantasies, including overcoming human limits, with the sci-fi author Paul McAuley, whose work tests the boundaries and politics of hard science, and the anthropologist Kathleen Richardson, who devotes her time to studying not humans, but robots, or possibly humans studying robots. But first, though, the philosopher John Gray on the Immortalisation Commission, Science and the Strange Quest to Cheat Death, which is a study of Victorian and Edwardian psychics and Soviet wood...
Including the minds of loved ones who'd passed on, were communicating with them by their hand-moving and revealing messages, messages which offered consolation, offered meaning, and offered hope. So what I think it's important to realise is that for pretty well all of the people involved in this practice, it was a form of science. It was conceived to be science, not religion, because for them, science was the authority. So they turned to science, if you like, for an exit from the meaningless world that science had revealed.
It's a poignant story in many ways because it is driven by intense yearning and emotion a lot of the time, but it is unintentionally, from time to time, comic as well. And you tell the extraordinary story of the idea of creating a spirit child, a real child who was going to be a sort of future world leader.
Yes, one of the most extraordinary episodes in this period, the Edwardian period, concerns the belief among a number of leading psychical researchers that deceased scientists were engaged in a eugenic experiment on the other side, whereby a child would be designed on the other side and appear in our world with extraordinary capacities and abilities, so extraordinary that this person could transform the world and bring peace to it. Now, there is a kind of subtext to this, which is that the key automatist involved in this was a woman, a Welsh suffragette, actually, but also someone intensely interested in art, and also the British representative at the League of Nations who practiced under a pseudonym. She was someone who'd lost a child in infancy, someone with what was described as a strong predilection to paternity, married to an older man, who we now believe produced the child as a result of a covert relationship with Gerald Balfour, Balfour's brother. But the
be supermen and the more modern dream of uploading human minds into machines. John, you cover a vast range of different attitudes to immortalisation in this short book. Let's just start with the sort of late Victorian Edwardian psychics and automatic writing. This was, by your account, very much driven by the high mortality, not just of the First World War, but remarkable numbers of people dying quite early of typhus or whatever, relatively young, and a desperate desire to replace fading religion with something else.
That's right. In the late Victorian and Edwardian periods, religion had lost its emotional hold over large sections of educated people, the intellectual elite, but also large sections of the middle classes. And all of these, the whole society really was, in a sense, under the spell of science, and in particular of Darwinism. And what Darwinism had revealed was a world in which, when individual humans died, they vanished, and the human species would eventually be extinct. And that vision, at a time when, we tend to forget, infant mortality was still very high. People lost lovers and fiancés, husbands, wives, and so on, at a rate which we can hardly imagine. There was a tremendous amount of almost unbearable grief. And several of the people involved in these, to us, rather incredible experiments, people like the politician Arthur Balfour's brother, also a conservative politician, but who gave up politics to devote his life to the study of the paranormal, and many others, including many women who had lost children in early years or lost loved ones, were involved in psychical research, and in particular in this practice of automatic writing, in which it seemed to them that minds other than their own,